Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here with us for a dedicated session on migrant workers and responsible business conduct. My name is Anna Platonova. I represent the International Organization for Migration, which is a UN-related organization working worldwide on migration issues, including labor migration. It is my great pleasure to see so many of you today for a topic that is very complex and which involves various transnational challenges that both governments and businesses face in an effort to protect rights of migrant workers throughout the process of migration. Now, speaking of responsible business conduct, mobile workers who move for a variety of reasons, being it for work, family reunification, studies, fleeing conflicts or persecution, many of them end up in work, being employed in their countries in their new countries of destination and living in the new receiving communities. So that presents various additional vulnerabilities and risks for exploitation, in particular for many of these workers, especially those that are poor and low-skilled. This happens not only due to challenges in the workplaces and the conditions of employment in the countries of destination, but due to various difficulties and violations that these workers encounter starting from the home communities and the point of recruitment. So in fact, recruitment often is the first step where many facets of exploitation begin. Vulnerability can also depend on whether workers move regularly or irregularly, whether they work in sectors that are formal or informal, and also the degrees of protection that their particular legal status ensures in the country of destination. So this is also a very lucrative business. Unfortunately, exploitation is a lucrative business for unscrupulous labor recruiters, for unscrupulous employers, unscrupulous sometimes government officials who collude with the private sector actors in the process of exploitation and abuse. And so in this session, we will look as to how companies can carry out due diligence in their own operations and also in their supply chains to proactively promote responsible recruitment and employment of migrant workers. Likewise, the session will also examine the various approaches and policies that governments can implement to create an enabling environment for responsible business conduct to protect all workers, including migrant workers. Now, I mentioned that a lot of these challenges are transnational, so in fact, in all the three pillars of business and human rights framework, protect, respect, and remedy, many of the solutions to various challenges experienced by migrant workers are transnational and demand additional cooperation and collaboration among a multitude of public and private actors. So to this end, I'm very pleased to facilitate a panel of experts today who represent various areas of work, public, private, civil society. and international organizations. I am joined here today on this panel by Mr. Nilim Barua, Senior Migration Specialist for Asia and the Pacific at the International Labour Organization, Mr. Van Zulkifli Benvan Sitapa, Director of the Institute of Labour Market Information and Analysis in Malaysia, Anbin Pan, who is Director for Global Government Affairs at Walmart, Kitty Potter, who leads on supplier responsibility in Apple, as well as Archana Kotecha, Asia Region Director and Head of Legal at Liberty Shared. So to start things off, Nilim, would you kindly set the global context and tell us what are some of the trends in migrant workflows that we have seen in recent years globally and specifically in Asia?
Thank you, Anna. Good afternoon, everybody. Migration provides millions of jobs and results in billions of dollars of remittances. A recent survey that we have done in Thailand of migrant workers from Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos shows that the migrant workers are earning about double of what they were previously earning. However, still there are decent work deficits in a number of migration corridors. Safe, orderly, and fair migration has the potential to deliver a triple win for migrants, businesses, and the societies in countries of origin and destination. But for that to happen, we need to ensure that migrant workers have access to decent work and their fundamental rights are respected. In terms of the numbers, according to the UN estimates, there are 258 million international migrants. Of the international migrants, around 64%, according to ILO estimates, are migrant workers. 58% of the international migrants are male and around 42% female. The Asia Pacific is host to around 20.4% of the international migrant workers, or some 33.5 million. If we add the Arab states, where most of the migrant workers are from Asia, that would be another 23 million people. Both men and women migrate, but women face common as well as different challenges to men, migrant workers. For example, they may have less access to formal or regular migration channels. Some countries, from time to time, ostensibly for protective reasons, put migration bans on sectors like domestic work, which are mainly staffed by women migrants. So when there are migration bans, we have found that the research has shown that women are still migrating, but through informal channels, so more unsafe channels. Some countries of destination also have rules and regulations that don't provide maternity benefits. And also, women's immigration status is tied to very gender-specific issues, and they may lose their immigration status in case of pregnancy in some countries. So we shouldn't think that men and women face the same problems. They do face common problems, but there's also a different set of problems. Now, the labor migration flows in Asia are mainly to the Middle East, to within ASEAN and to ASEAN countries, and to East Asian economies, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Republic of Korea, and Taiwan, and Japan, sorry. It's interesting to know that the recorded migration flows from 12 Asian countries, sending countries, have actually declined about 6% from 2015 to 2017. There are some 3 million migrant workers who leave every year to go to work in the Middle East, mainly the GCC countries. But there has been a fall in flows to the GCC countries, mainly as a result of the fall in oil prices, which affects investment in infrastructure projects, where they're mainly migrant workers who are working in the private sector in the GCC. Now, migrant workers in the region, they comprise workers working in elementary occupations, like domestic work, general laborers in construction, manufacturing, agriculture services, as well as middle-skilled workers, that is technicians, including welders, carpenters, masons, and highly skilled migrant workers. I think that is important to remember for Asia. Asia is one of the main source regions for highly skilled migrants. Now, with regards to labor migration policies, what is clear is today countries are competing for skilled workers, for talent. You know that Singapore for many years has had policies to attract talent. Similarly, there have been policies in place for many years in New Zealand and Australia, in the US, in Canada, but more recently in Japan and also China. So admission policies for skilled workers have become more liberalized, but this is not the case for workers in elementary occupations, so-called low-skilled workers. But at the same time, there is a strong demand for workers in elementary occupations due to relative labor shortages. That is, the nationals are not filling the more difficult and low-paying jobs. Demographic evolution in income disparities and skills and labor shortages will continue to drive migration. At the same time, we should remember that in the long run, some jobs that are currently filled by migrant workers may be replaced by technology, automation, as well as outsourcing and digital labor platforms. I think it's important to remember that there shouldn't be an over-dependence on migrant workers in certain sectors, like in view of productivity, you know, sometimes availability of so-called cheap labor may inhibit investment in technologies. Just to give you an example, I was talking to a colleague yesterday. The ILO has been implementing a ship-to-shore rights project in Thailand with regards to sea fisheries and the seafood sector. And the Thai vessels have a lot of scope actually to introduce technology which will reduce their demand for workers because they have difficulty in getting workers. Local workers are not working on the vessels, and for migrant workers as well, sea fisheries is actually one of their least favored options. But there's an alternative to make the vessels more efficient with the use of technology and reduce the dependence on migrant workers. So we must keep this angle in mind as well.
Thank you so much, Nilim, for this overview and really highlighting the variety of contexts in which labor migration happens globally, including in Asia, where many countries, such as the one where we are right now, Thailand, are countries of origin and destination, and where workers of all skill levels are moving with various challenges associated with this process. Now, Malaysia is one of the key countries of destination in this region, and for sure one of the largest countries of destination in ASEAN. Mr. Van Zulkifli, migrant workers are a robust part of the Malaysian workforce. What, in your view, are the positive contributions that migrant workers make to the economy and Malaysia's strong role in global supply chains?
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you, Anna. And thank you as well for the organizer because inviting me to be part of this forum. Let me briefly sharing with you about Malaysia and migrant workers in Malaysia. The current population of Malaysia is 32.4 million. Malaysia has the fourth largest number of migrants and the seventh highest ratio of migrants to the total population in East Asia Pacific. As of 30th April 2019, there are 2.026 million registered immigrants in Malaysia. And based from World Bank study, it is likely between 1 and 1.5 million undocumented immigrants in our country. In 2018, migrant workers making up 15.8% of Malaysia's workforce, excluding a total of 117,000 expatriates. There are 13 source countries which is sending their citizens to Malaysia, which is Indonesia comprises the highest number of migrant workers with 35.2%, followed by Bangladesh and Nepal with 28.1% and 16.10% respectively. As labor market remains tight, migrant workers has filled gaps in low and mid-skilled jobs, which make up 3/4 of all jobs in Malaysia. In econometric modeling suggests that a 10% net increase in low-skilled migrant workers may increase Malaysia's GDP by as much as 1.1%, which is this one also quite high with regard to 2 million foreign workers in our country. And for every 1,000 new migrant workers, will create 601 new jobs, of which 67 are part-time for Malaysian workers. The effect on men and women seems to vary significantly, especially in terms of total employment. Changes in employment due to increase in employment of migrant workers do not lead to significant changes in the wages of Malaysian workers, mainly due to tightness of labor markets, which is a 10% increase in immigration flow slightly increase the wages of Malaysians by 0.14% only. Yet, it significantly reduces salaries of migrant workers already in the country by 3.94%, and also reduce wages of the least educated Malaysians, which is represent 14% of the total workforce by 0.78%. Although population growth has remained relatively high in Malaysia, its rapidly expanding economy, increasing urbanization, and relatively low level of participation among women continue to create a major demand for migrant workers. With close to full employment since 1990, which is the current unemployment rate is 3.4%, migrant workers have for many years filled substantial shortages in the supply of low-skilled key recent policies development. Approximately 1/3 of the manufacturing, agriculture, construction workforce and are migrant workers. industry which collectively contribute Malaysian ringgit 442 billion, or 34.2% of Malaysia's GDPs in 2018. With regard to remittances, I would say that approximately 30 billion ringgit Malaysia a year, migrant workers send money back home. With all the good reasons, that's why Malaysian's government remain its policy to permit employers to engage migrant workers abroad. I made to understand that this session also would like to share the latest development on the recruitment process in Malaysia and how the government, through its laws and latest policies, could eliminate element of forced labor during the entire process of recruitment activities, starting from pre-departure training in source country until the workers safely reach the workplace where they are going to work and stay for a minimum 2 years, up to a maximum 10 years in Malaysia, as well as during its employment time in Malaysia until the migrant workers completed their contracts. So for this one, maybe I go for the second round, and then I give the floor to Annabelle. Yes.
Thank you so much for this balanced and evidence-based background. I think, in a way, in a continuation of what Nilim has mentioned about also the risks of over-reliance on, in particular, cheap migrant labor, and one of the reasons it's cheap is because the costs of using migrant labor are actually not the real costs. In many ways, they are transferred back to workers. So this kind of race to the bottom can also result in diluting labor standards on the national labor market. And you've mentioned the challenges for maintaining the wage level of existing migrant workers and also low-skilled Malaysian workers. And in fact, in many countries of destination worldwide where similar analysis were undertaken, such findings were also present. So thank you so much for that. Today we are also focusing on the role of companies in supporting responsible recruitment and employment of migrant workers. And before we move into specific challenges and opportunities, Kitty, would you please describe what the supply chain of an electronics company such as Apple looks like, where and how migrant workers contribute along these supply chains? Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. It's really wonderful to be here today with these panellists and with all of you, and it's been a really interesting series of conversations. In the panel that I attended before lunch, one of the speakers was asking about, companies that have teams working on supply chain responsibility, human rights, and whether or not that's reflected at the top of their company or if it's just low-level people engaged in this work. And we're incredibly fortunate at Apple because our CEO, Tim Cook, is a great champion and a great advocate of human rights on many different fronts, and has stated on many occasions that he believes that business at its best it serves the public good and binds us all collectively. And that's really the basis from which a lot of our work in the human rights space emerges. It's this idea that collectively, through collaboration, through working with different parties, we really can resolve some of these toughest issues. You asked me, Anna, to talk specifically about our supply chain. So for us, it's a really broad definition. It's global, and our responsibility is global in that sense. So we make products from all over the world for consumers all over the world. That starts with mineral sourcing and the mining of raw materials in places like the DRC, all the way through to smelters and refiners in China, through to the sourcing of components, modules, for example, the camera in your iPhone, through to final assembly, facilities that test and package goods that then go to retail stores and to other sellers throughout the world, all the way through to after-sales care and the final recycling of products. So for us, supply chain is just literally cradle to grave. And I think in that sense, you know, we make it a priority to assess and to really find out at facilities across the world what is going on as part of our commitment to our code of conduct. Last year we did over 1,000 supplier visits and assessments. Over 770 of them were Apple managed audits, so that's our team going in and doing those assessments, and the remainder were done by third parties in smelters and refiners. So our supply chain is huge, our responsibility is huge. Where do migrant workers fit into all of that? So we know that migrant workers are a part of our supply chain through our assessments and through the interaction we have with suppliers. We're really deeply committed to understanding how these demographics shift year on year. It's an incredibly dynamic landscape. The manufacturing sector is constantly evolving and changing. Our products are constantly evolving and changing. But of the millions of people in our supply chain, actually foreign contracted workers is a relatively small percentage. But obviously that group of people is probably the most vulnerable in our supply chain. That's where some of the highest risks are in terms of potential violations of human rights, and specifically what we have found, you know, over the many years that we've been assessing suppliers, debt bonded labour, which has been a really critical centrepiece of the programming that we've done in this area. So one of the things that Apple started to do very early, and we're really proud and delighted to see that a lot of our practices have now been adopted by other companies, and through our work with the RBA, we can see that the repayment of fees that workers pay in order to get a job is becoming a standard or a practice that a lot of companies are starting to implement in their codes of conduct and in their supply chain requirements. So since we started this work in 2008, $30.9 million has been repaid to workers by our suppliers, and that's been the direct result of our assessments and our intervention, finding out where workers have paid inordinate sums of money to get a job. I mean, essentially, we don't believe that anybody should have to pay to get a job, particularly the most vulnerable people in our supply chain. I might leave it there for now, Anna, and can follow up on some of these, you know, issues in the next round. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kitty. And indeed, we will have more space to go into further details. And I think one of the values of having companies such as Apple and Walmart here is the wealth of also practical approaches that have been tested in the past years in addressing these various challenges. But we're also very lucky to have with us today Archana, who is one of the key experts in the field. And Archana, would you tell us a bit more about various vulnerabilities that migrant workers face, and what are the exact human rights and labor risks linked to common current recruitment practices, as well as how you see the shared responsibilities of governments and businesses in addressing these risks?
Sure. Thank you, Anna, and thank you for the platform. I'm so grateful to be able to give voice to some of the issues that we are observing in the course of our work as an organization. So my area of focus is labor exploitation and human trafficking. So forgive me if I come across as being quite dark in my observations. Let me set the scene a little bit. We are talking about a region, so my work focuses on Southeast Asia, a region where most migrant workers in destination countries don't have the freedom to associate, where criminal defamation is regularly used to silence workers or human rights defenders who try to seek enforcement of their rights in court, but also where there are frequently reprisals or retaliatory actions by companies. Now, within that framework, the business of forced labor and human exploitation is estimated to be worth around $51 billion US, which is significant. And Nilim talked earlier about the value of migration generally, and this is the value of exploitation, much of which is pegged to the migration as well. Some of the vulnerabilities in this space experienced by migrant workers start at the very early stage of recruitment, where excessive fees are paid, and at which point the debt becomes almost a form of psychological coercion for the worker. What happens practically is with this particular debt and comes things like salary deductions, various other expenses, borrowing of money in order to meet commitments back home or just for living expenses. Often these are from loan sharks, which involve huge interest payments as well. The other dimension of the vulnerability relates to passport retention. Many of the work permit processes or migration or arriving in a destination country and starting work involve surrendering passports. Passport retention, document retention still remain relatively widespread across the region, and that also adds a further dimension to vulnerability. And I want to take a moment to reflect a little bit on what is forced labor. Forced labor is a labor market issue, and it really is something which not just involves exploitative recruitment practices, but also bad living and working conditions, and various other defective labor justice mechanisms and protections. Much of my work has involved working with people who work in the informal sector, where they're quite invisible, their legal protections are weak. Much of the labor laws across the region protect those in regular employment, who have contracts, who are in the country legitimately. And therefore, they fall back on forced labor laws or trafficking laws to protect them in the event that there is any form of exploitation. Let me tell you this, I've been doing trafficking work for 15 years. Trafficking laws are out of reach of most people who experience exploitation. It's very hard to prove trafficking in a court of law, and all the efforts that go into bringing a case in the first place. When it comes to forced labor laws, it's a regime that is still maturing across the region. Thailand became the first country to ratify the optional protocol to the Convention 29, and there is a new forced labor law in Thailand. It remains to see how it will be implemented. But essentially, what happens with a lot of these protections is they're quite stark and they're binary. You either fall into it or you fall out of it. The reality of employment, the reality of labor, and the dynamic relationship that is a labor relationship is that we require a much more elastic and reactive system in order to deal with labor issues, ranging from issues of singular labor law violations to more complex labor violations such as forced labor or human trafficking at the other end of the spectrum. We are finding it extremely difficult to be able to access justice in courts of law, and where there is a sort of a reliance on alternative dispute resolution mechanisms, such as operational grievance mechanisms, very often these are created without the consultation of workers or communities affected, which means that they often they're not the best to serve the purposes. In relation to the National Human Rights Commissions and various others, there are limitations to what they can do too. So it really is a mixed picture. And I think, from my perspective, Anna, you asked earlier about what could governments do and what can companies do. We can talk about this the whole day. But let me sum it up rather eloquently in 2 words. Create consequences. The migrant workers we work with face consequences for every action or every inaction. When it comes to the companies that violate their rights, they don't face consequences. When you think about, and I'm talking very specifically in the context of corporate liability from a criminal perspective, how many cases are there against corporations in this region for forced labor or for human trafficking? How many directors are held accountable for their reckless disregard for the impact of the work of their corporations on vulnerable people? You can count on one hand across the region how many such cases there are. These cases are notoriously difficult to bring, And given the cross-border nature of these issues, it's also extremely difficult to mount these cases across countries, particularly with the limited resources that NGOs have. So, it is really important to solicit not just the help of companies who are leading in this space and who are doing the right things to set a good example, but there has to be consequences for those who are not willing to toe the line. The creation of transparency and corporate accountability, because at the end of the day, forced labor, human trafficking, the different shades of exploitation are criminal offenses, whichever way you look at it. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Archana, for this very, indeed, eloquent and clear message about responsibility and accountability as a basis for any proper action in this field. At the end, indeed, as you said, what we're talking here, the most severe and extreme forms of exploitation, they are crimes, and they should be addressed as such. We have here with us also Anbin Pan, who is Director for Global Government Affairs, and Walmart. And now Walmart is both the owner of brands and a retailer who has been active in the field of responsible recruitment and employment for some years now. Anbin, why has Walmart engaged in this topic, and what would be the three most valuable lessons learned as to what drives responsible recruitment in your supply chains and what works?
Well, thank you, Anna, and to all the panelists here today, just sharing about our work on responsible recruitment. It's my 10th day in Bangkok, and I came here from Walmart headquarters in Bentonville, Arkansas. And you might be wondering, what does one person do for 10 days in Bangkok? And I'd like to share, because I think that I have a prepared speech, but I think that sort of illustrates the work that we're doing here. I spent 3 days with the Seafood Task Force, the task force that was set up to bring in suppliers and to bring in retail brands like Costco, Aldi, Walmart, and as well as civil society groups to talk about what it looks like to have a sustainable seafood business in Thailand, including, of course, responsible recruitment of migrant workers. So that was that piece. I spent time speaking to the U.S. ASEAN Business Council, representing multinational corporations that do business in Southeast Asia, talking to them about how we might engage the U.S. Embassy on these topics, how we could potentially collaborate on a meeting with the ministers of labor of ASEAN through their leverage and connection with the U.S. ASEAN Business Council. I did take a day off on Saturday, and I went to a sustainable toy factory where I got toys for my kids. So I must say that I also had fun. And then on Sunday, we had a team of buyers here. Actually, I should mention, on Friday, at the end of the Seafood Task Force, that day with heavy rain and a lot of traffic here in Bangkok, we actually had our DMM for the, which is Divisional Merchandise Manager here. So we had all our senior buyers here in Thailand for the seafood sector, and we brought our suppliers, Thai Royal, Thai Union, Marine Gold, CP Foods, together to talk about responsible recruitment, the work that they're doing to reward suppliers who are doing good work. So I'm illustrating through this trip pieces of who was here from Walmart, without going, technical for you. And so we engaged them. What are you doing in your supply chains? How are these principles of no fees, passport retention, how are you executing against that in your work? And so then, so that was, Friday, I told you about Saturday. And then Sunday, we visited one of our suppliers, a shrimp farm. And so they're engaging the very piece of our business. And at the end of the day, Anna's absolutely right. We are a retail business, And we have our own direct imports. We have a sourcing office in Bangkok, a small one that does everything from tuna to pineapples to dried mangoes and jasmine rice. We create jobs, and we are responsible for the jobs in these supply chains, and we're strategically thinking about how we can have a sustainable business that within the context of many complex issues that you've heard on the supply chain. That was the purpose of CWEB here this week in Thailand too, to look at not just sustainability in Thailand for the seafood sector, but for the whole world, for the global world. We're looking at 2050 expected population of 9 billion. How do we have sustainable food and for the planet? And how do we do that in a way that doesn't go beyond maximum sustainable yield? And so we're looking at these issues. And here, coming to this conference, engaging all of you on specifically a range of issues related to business. I share this as an illustration that hopefully will stay with you. At Walmart, I'll just say 3 things related to what we've learned. And it's similar to what Kitty said. Let's go to the top of the house. Let's get that CEO commitment. Our CEO in November of 2016 made a commitment to look at responsible recruitment. By the end of, this is our public commitment that's in our environmental, social, and governance report that says, by the end of 2026, we want responsible recruitment to be the standard business practice for employers throughout the global supply chain. So that is why we have a 3-prong approach. We have work in our industry initiatives team. That's why we're here for the Seafood Task Force. We sent 4 or 5 people throughout the different days to engage on industry initiatives like the Responsible Business Alliance that you heard of in the plenary, the Consumer Goods Forum, the Leadership Group for Responsible Recruitment. We're trying to change the industry for good. And then also philanthropy. We have Walmart Foundations, which has granted approximately, from the last 3 years, $26 million to philanthropic organizations such as International Justice Mission, who's here in the room today, to look at criminal analytics, to bring cases to regarding forced labor from the courts from Cambodia to Thailand, rings of human trafficking, to disrupt the system, because we know as a retailer, you have to disrupt or be disrupted. So we want to disrupt the systems that exist, that have existed, to bring in migrant workers through illegal channels. And finally, I am here, on the piece of advocacy. I spent the entire morning at the Ministry of Labor talking to the Director General and the Deputy Director General of the Department of Protection Labor Welfare. We're looking at everything from the port in, port out system. Something they just noted to me today that I thought was fascinating. Thai government officials are not allowed to inspect other flagged vessels. So they can inspect Thai flagged vessels, but they cannot inspect vessels from the Philippines or the Marshall Islands or from Taiwan in Thai waters. These are the types of things that will get to that piece on law enforcement, just engaging the government and hearing what they're saying. We talked about how do we strengthen the MOU system. Migrant workers are coming in informally into Thailand, and the formal systems are expensive. They are complicated to use. So that's how migrant workers are coming in informal systems. So how does the government strengthen the formal MOU system? And how do we provide training, for the piece related to the labor inspectors, to make sure that the new amendment to the anti-trafficking law related to forced labor is executed against. I can go and say more, and I think for a company like Walmart, exactly what Kitty said. Our first responsibility is our own supply chain. That's everything from auditing, looking if workers are paying recruitment fees. We've had trainings for auditors to find those indicators of forced labor. That's actually difficult. The Ministry of Labor and I this morning just completely had an eye-to-eye on how difficult it is to identify forced labor in the audit systems and through inspections. We need to increasingly have more money going to interpreters, to rights, understanding for migrant workers, to really, for companies to really look at our own supply chains. We're doing a mapping project with the IOM so that we can understand what is happening in our suppliers' facilities and to understand our own supply chains. And I think I'll just end with this. Partnership is the new leadership. When you are a company as large as we are, we're in 27 different countries. We serve 270 million customers per week, and we have over 100,000 suppliers. It's not easy to trace and track your supply chain, but working through industry initiatives, through associations, through philanthropic efforts, and through government advocacy to address these issues, that we can make a real change for migrant workers so that we can live up to our public commitment. It's a big one, it's a bold one. In fact, I may have gotten some giggles from the Ministry of Labor this morning when we shared it with them, but by the end of 2026, we want responsible recruitment to be the standard business practice for employers throughout the global supply chain. And we're putting our best foot forward to engaging, working with great leaders like the RBA, the Leadership Group for Responsible Recruitment, the Seafood Task Force, to make that a reality. So I completely went off my talking points, but I wanted to share some of the anecdotes that have gone into the work this week. And just like yourself, just like everyone on this panel, it's work that requires all of us. It's work that is for, when I went to the port-in, port-out system, for the Burmese workers who have the white stripes painted on their faces who are on those vessels. It's for those who are in facilities making electronic products that go into our phones. It's for the produce workers in Central America who are coming into Mexico, who are bringing tomatoes into the United States. This work is for them. And it's not easy work because we have a world of great inequality where people are trying to migrate to find a better life. But I think it's worth every piece of effort that we put in. And it's very important because society is judged by how we treat the most vulnerable people and how we put protections in for the most vulnerable people. And so we'll continue to engage governments, improve our own business practices, and come to a place in society where we're really respecting migrant workers. Because myself, I was joking with Anna earlier this week, I am a migrant. My parents migrated from Vietnam to the United States. And let me tell you, IOM did our pre-departure training. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anbin. We really value Walmart's commitment to advance responsible recruitment worldwide and in this region in particular, and look forward to future partnership. Thank you. Nilim, I think it's a good moment to, as we go into the practical details, to speak a bit more about what recruitment fees actually are. They have been notoriously difficult to define. So if you could please remind us some of the key features of the ILO Fair Recruitment Principles and Guidelines, and also guidance on the recruitment fees that came out recently, and perhaps some of the relevance of this guidance to the work that also businesses are doing.
Thank you, Anna. I think over the last 20 years, we have seen that remittance costs have fallen. Remittance costs, the money that migrants paid to remit money, the transfer fees, the exchange rate, were very high, but that has fallen over the last 20 years. Now, Similarly, recruitment cost or migration cost is too high at the moment, and there's a lot of scope to reduce recruitment cost and migration costs. ILO World Bank surveys have shown that for Pakistan to Saudi Arabia and Bangladesh to Kuwait, the migration cost for workers equals to about 9 months' wages in the destination country. From Vietnam to Malaysia, they equal 3 months' wages. And from Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar to Thailand, it's lower because many use informal channels, but still it's almost 2 months' wages. So there's a lot of scope to reduce migration costs and recruitment fees. There's a trade-off when using informal channels. Our surveys have shown, although the cost may be lower, often you are in employment and working conditions which are worse. The conditions are better when you use formal channels. So with regards to the ILO fair recruitment principles and guidelines, I think on the principles it's important to remember two areas. One is that it's based on existing human rights and labor standards. So recruitment and the employment contract that comes with recruitment should not, for example, be discouraging or not allowing freedom of association and collective bargaining, because that's part of international labor standards. The other important area of the ILO fair recruitment principles, there are a number of areas, but because of time I'll only emphasize two, is that no fees or related costs should be paid by workers. Now, later, just this year, the ILO has put forward further guidance on the definition of recruitment fees and related costs. Now, the definition of recruitment fees is quite straightforward. It is the placement fee, the fee that the recruiter gets, or if there's no recruiter in between, the employer gets for the job matching. That's recruitment fees. And there are a number of codes of conduct of employers, even of recruiters, that is clear on this, that the recruitment fee should not be paid by the worker. It should be employer paid. Now, the area of related costs is a bit more complicated. But the ILO definition on related costs is that these are expenses integral to recruitment and placement. So it's like the broadest understanding and interpretation of costs. However, the competent authority has the flexibility to determine exceptions to their applicability after due consultation with the most representative workers and employers organizations and subject to certain conditions, that it's in the interest of the workers, it's specific, and that the corresponding related costs are disclosed to the worker. So there's a broad definition of related costs, but the competent authority, there's flexibility for the competent authority to make exceptions. I think, Anna, I'll just add another point about employment and working conditions. We have been focusing a lot on responsible recruitment, and that's correct. But we should not forget about employment and working conditions, and particularly wages. I mean, better wages is the reason why migrant workers are going to work in another country, to earn better and to send money home. So wage protection, for example, simple measures that the employer has to use a bank transfer to make the wages, helps in wage protection. And second is about inclusion of migrant workers in minimum wage. In many countries, domestic workers are not included in minimum wage law because they're not protected by the labor law. As a result, they are amongst the lowest paid. The respect for freedom of association and collective bargaining, because this increases the potential to get better wages.
Thank you so much, Nilim, for these important updates and explanations. Indeed, the fair recruitment principles and guidelines and the recent guidance on fees are also part of the basis of the IOM-led multi-stakeholder international recruitment integrity system, which is a voluntary certification scheme for international labor recruiters that we start to roll out in Asia with various public and private partners this year, which will be a way how labor recruiters can actually show their compliance with the international standards in this field and identified good practice. And indeed, we speak a lot about recruitment fees and worker-borne recruitment fees as one of the key indicators of debt bondage and subsequently forced labor. But of course, debt bondage also occurs because workers are very badly paid. So indeed, thank you for bringing back in the discussion about the wages and the working conditions. All are fields that are very much within the remit of direct action of suppliers and brands. Kitty, would be great if you could share with us perhaps 3 most valuable lessons that Apple has learned in your extensive work to promote responsible recruitment and in employment. And also if you could share some perhaps practical details about the initiatives that you mentioned, in particular reimbursement of fees by suppliers and how this can effectively be done. Just mindful of the time, if perhaps you could keep it short. Thank you.
Sure, so I'll jump to the end and I'll give you a practical example. So last year in 2018, 2 cases of debt-bonded labour were uncovered at our suppliers. So in both those cases, I mean, we consider this a core violation. In both those cases, the supplier was placed on a 1-year probationary period effective immediately, and they were required to repay all the fees to those impacted employees, those migrant workers. Just like companies that spend many years establishing their assessment tools and audit protocols, we have a very specific audit protocol to detect debt-bonded labour and the verification of the repayment of fees. So there were 2 very specific cases last year. In terms of the most valuable lessons, I think the first one is, standards are the absolute foundation. You have to have your code of conduct, you have to have your standards, they have to be detailed, they have to be communicated within your own company, and they have to be communicated to all of your suppliers. But it's not just enough to have the standards, you actually have to have practical mechanisms in place where you can audit against those standards, take remedial action, and in our manufacturing contracts, for example, the code of conduct is a term and condition of the manufacturing contract, and there are penalties for failure to comply. So it's not just the standards as a foundation, but it's all the mechanisms that you put in place. When you were talking kind of about consequences, and I think that's a really critical piece. I think the second thing that we've learned is that in this case, remediation is actually not enough. I mean, remedy, repaying fees to people, is really just the first step. For us now, we're moving more from remedy into prevention. So how do we go to the source of this issue before workers even enter our supply chain? And that's where the really hard work of collaboration with other companies across industries, with government entities through partners like the IOM, to identify and map those labour corridors, what the different regulations are, the challenges that we're going to have with these sort of cross-border issues. Prevention is going to be really difficult, but that is the work that we need to concentrate on going forward now that we have the remedy protocols strongly in place. The third thing is for us, in terms of the challenge or the next critical phase of work, is how we go beyond supply chain and responsibility, beyond manufacturing. And so, for example, I'm talking about Apple retail stores. So we've started to look at, for example, how to help humans of trafficking get jobs in our supply chain and in our retail stores. We've looked at the amount of subcontracting that's being done for custodial staff in our retail stores. So they're sort of the three biggest challenges and areas of work for us going forward.
Thank you so much, Kitty, and again, pleasure for us to work with Apple on these issues within IOM's initiative called CREST, Corporate Responsibility in Eliminating Slavery and Trafficking, which in this region is also made possible by the government of Sweden and the partner companies that take serious leadership in these issues. So thank you so much for that. Perhaps it is the right moment to also hear back from the government again, and Malaysia recently has taken a number of policy steps to protect migrant workers. Mr. Van Zulkifli, could you please share some of the recent updates on policy decisions that Malaysia has made and some of the remaining challenges?
Thank you. The first things I would like to what we call share as well the current policies and laws regulating migrant workers in Malaysia. Now, unlike with other countries, in Malaysia there are two main ministries taking care of migrant workers, which is the first one is Ministry of Human Resources, ensuring priority is given to local workers in terms of job opportunities and to ensure that labor rights and protection for foreign workers. That one under Ministry of Human Resources. And the second one is under Ministry of Home Affairs, in charge in terms of security and immigration affairs, inflow and outflow of foreign workers, including expatriate, foreign students, and illegal migrant as well. In paper, it looks nice, but when in terms of implementation, sometimes we do not know which one is under MOHA and which one is under MOHR. So that's the issue. The recruitment of foreign workers open only for 5 sectors, namely manufacturing, plantation, services, construction, agriculture, and also for domestic worker. In terms of coverage of injuries, we recently come out with a policy that employer also have to pay for foreign workers workmen's compensation under the SOSO Act, which is the same with the local workers. So this one a very big achievement for Malaysia, because I would say that under Convention 19, we keep being scrutinized by the Committee on the Application of Standards in the IRC. So now, by December 2020, both local and foreign workers, complete all of them will be covered under SOSO Act. That's the first things. In terms of implementation of minimum wage, it covers both local and foreign workers. And also, because of the forced labor issues, starting March this year, we already abolish all the outsourcing companies. So this is also the good things about the latest policies we have. In terms of contract of employment, actually every employer who want to hire foreign migrant workers, they have to have a standard contract of service, which is provided by what we call Malaysia government. Actually, this contract of service already agreeable by 2 countries the sending and the receiving countries. If you have more time with this, I will go further about the contract, the content of the contract of employment. Employers also have to ensure that foreign workers receive the foreign workers identity card, because some of the employers in Malaysia, they keep what we call keeping the workers' passport, actually under the immigration, under the Passport Act, which is prohibited to the employers to save, to keep the workers' passport in this regard. In terms of levy, now we have two-tier levy, which is agriculture and non-agriculture. Which is agriculture, the levy is 460 ringgit, and then for non-agriculture is 1,850 ringgit. But in this January 2020, coming 2020, we will introduce a multi-tier levy scheme. The reason why we come out with this proposal, multi-tier levy scheme, because there are so many employers feels that the quota system is not so good, because especially in E&E sector, because they say the quota one foreign workers to 3 local is very limited to them. So because of that, we already changed to 3 foreign workers to 1 local, but still it's not enough to them. Because of that, sometimes employer go through the bad ways. And then these are the things which is not good for the country, because element of corruption and so on and so forth can be made here. And then because of that, we will introduce a multi-tier levy scheme, which is the more the employer apply for migrant workers, the more they have to pay levy. So very simple. So we hope that after this, we don't have any problem in terms of this. With regard to the the employer, actually under the MOU, employer have to bear all the costs. Okay, employers' cost and also employees' cost. But in terms of implementation, it's not like that. This is the issue actually. So we here have to discuss actually. Oh, another 2 minutes. Recently, we have independent committee have to look for the management of foreign workers in our countries. And then this independent committee already complete their task and already what we call convey to the government. And then I would say that there are 8 main core recommendations, which is with regard to national policy, with regard to recruitment, employment, repatriation, regularization of undocumented workers, refugees and stateless persons, access to justice, and make it the report public to everybody. With regard to the national policy, the independent committee proposed that, recommended that only 1 single ministry to handle about migrant workers issues. Recruitment to develop an end-to-end single online system as key component of a foreign workers management system. In terms of employment, of course, there are so many recommendations here, but because, and I say only 1 minute more, so ensure an efficient and smooth process of employers to employ foreign workers. In terms of repatriation, portability of social security payments and benefits, regularization, which is recommendation, proposed that a new amnesty program with flexible terms and incentive to enhance attractiveness and effectiveness. With regard to refugees and stateless persons should be given identities the opportunities and the right to work as well. Access to justice, foreign workers should have meaningful access to justice and barriers for such access addressed. And the last one, to make the report public. I think that one. Thank you very much.
Perfect. You make me very happy. Thank you. At this stage, I would like to open the floor to questions and comments. Please introduce yourselves before you speak. Please.
Hello, thank you for the opportunity. So I'm Linda from Indonesia. So I'll highlight most in the problem of women migrant workers because this is the huge problem in my country. So in Indonesia, most of women working abroad is in informal sector and mostly as a domestic worker. So according to the data from ILO, 283,000 and 640 migrant workers in 2018, and 198 and 975 are female, and 150 of them are migrant domestic workers. So I think the root of the problem might be the weaknesses of domestic law in protecting migrant workers, especially women, and the cultural that places women in inferior entities as an inferior entities as others is others' problem. So my question, especially for Mr. Nilim Barua from ILO, so how do we overcome the problem of legal weaknesses in domestic law with regard to the migrant worker, especially for women migrant workers? And my second question is, how do we put gender perspective toward both states and company in addressing this issue? Thank you.
Thank you. I suggest we take a few more questions. Please, a colleague in the red scarf.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Linda Kromjong, Samsung Electronics. Thank you very much for, I would say, a very interesting panel. And Samsung Electronics, I think, like any other companies, we do have issues with migrant workers. And we try hard to solve them when we come across them and indeed also look into preventive measures. I think this is a step-by-step approach. We're learning, and whilst we first focus on our own production facilities where we have limited migrant workers, I think the focus is now on our subcontractors, even I think more than maybe probably on our suppliers, because subcontractors to some extent are even more vulnerable because of the low margin services they do deliver. Having said that, we also move into the solution. We are very clear, no recruitment fees being paid, it should be repaid. But then what happens if you have given, say, the period of grace to your supplier or your subcontractor and repaying, and it doesn't happen? You ask another time, but at some point in time, your period of grace ends and you conclude the relationship. That does leave the workers without remedy. And Samsung, how good we strive to be, we can't solve the world alone. We need to find collaborative solutions. And we try to do that with working together with partners. The question I think I have to the panel is, what can be done collectively and what suggestions would you have to, say, compensate workers that are not being able to give them access to remedy when you have exhausted your leverage, basically? So that's a concrete question. I would welcome any suggestion from your side. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please.
Ghazal from Global March Against Child Labour, India. My question is that, so first of all, there's a lot of discussion about inter-country migration, but what about migration that takes place inside of the countries and which is equally significant because these people are equally involved in the supply chain work, no matter how far or at the bottom they may be. And while at the international level, the remittance costs can be counted, it's very difficult to reach these invisible tiers in the supply chain because these workers are from certain sections and have been employed in socially accepted discriminatory systems of agrarian economy, such as in India, where that bondage not only occurs because they don't get enough money, but because also they are from a certain section of the society. And secondly, how it impacts other things. For example, it forces their children to work or keep on paying the debt for 2 generations, 3 generations. It makes their children drop out of the school or have irregular schooling, and additional burden of invisible labor done by girls and women, both at the farm or in the factories, or and also inside the home. So yeah, how can these intricate but very significant questions be addressed? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would suggest that we take 2 more questions. Please, you and you.
Thank you. My name is Thakon from TBA, Thai Boiler Association from Thailand. Regarding on the migrant fee, for Thailand, once they cross the border within Thailand, all the workers don't have to pay anything at the moment. Many companies practice like this. Okay. Look back to the origin country. There's a first one is Laos. They don't have any paperwork, let's say identification card, how register. When they need this, they need to get the signature from the village chief to sign on it. There's a fee to do that. For Myanmar, there has a law to pay to the agency 150,000 baht, which is equivalent to $100 US. But they actually pay outside of that. The worker have to pay like 650,000, 280,000 to anybody. I don't know which is I don't know. Okay, and the last one is the Cambodia. Cambodia, the visa fee is only about 25, but other stuff can be like same thing. People come from the village that poor knowledge. They don't even know the language. They don't even know how to write. So they pay for the service fee, which is not recruitment fee. They slightly, change the wording. How can we? My question is, how can we eliminate that the other expense, which is that we don't know who to pay to. If we are asking employer to pay things like this, that will support on the human trafficking, right? So that, how can we cooperate? ILO or maybe NGO that can cooperate together? That's what my question.
Thank you so much, and let's have the last question.
Thank you very much. Also, all the inspirations from the panel. I think the issue of human trafficking is quite complex simply because
Would you please introduce yourself?
My name is Ciprianus from Indonesia, from UNDP Indonesia. It's quite complex simply because the chain is also quite complex. Now, in the end of the day, I think one big issue about this is really the corruption within the system of a country. But then, at the same time, some initiatives have been put in place, for instance, by the government of Malaysia, which is something that is worth of appreciation. But then because you cannot solve one problem in the destination country if there is no concerted collaboration with the country that sends all of these people. So my question to the Malaysian government is, have there been any attempts, of a cross-country collaborations to enforce the, how do you say that? Maybe not to enforce, to advocate the responsible recruitment. My second question is to Kitty from Apple. I think the 3 steps that you've outlined is pretty clear. But then, you know, as a global company, in the end of the day, the enforcement should be done at the local level. And company alone cannot solve the problem. You should also get the state to take part, the civil society to take part, so that the problem is really open and everybody takes responsibility. Have there been any actions from your side to walk the extra mile to make sure that such a mechanism can then be upheld in collaboration with other partners? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And if I could now turn back to the panel. There were some questions that were to specific panel members, but feel free to answer to the whole range. Archana, would you like to begin?
Yeah, just to react to a couple of those. One was the first question about the Indonesian situation and domestic workers in particular. I live in Hong Kong. We see a lot of Indonesian domestic workers migrate to Hong Kong. One of the fundamental problems which leads to exploitation in that particular population is the fact that they do pay a very hefty placement fee, which is required by their state before they are able to migrate to Hong Kong. So by the time they arrive in Hong Kong, it takes nearly 6 to 8 months of work for full-time salary deduction in order for that fee to be paid. If that worker experiences abuse in the first 6 to 8 months, it's unlikely that they're able to leave to find help, simply because they will need to find more money for the next placement fee for the next job. There are some systemic deficiencies here, one of which is the requirement in the source country for the payment of this fee. And then the second one is the weak framework, the weak legal framework in destination countries, for example, around working hours, around various other elements, or in some countries where domestic workers aren't even included in the formal labor laws that do allow for exploitation of this particular group. Another point I wanted to pick up on is the last gentleman spoke about enforcement at local level. I couldn't agree more with you, because while the multinationals and the large corporations can travel around the world and do their own leading advocacy with various government groups, the reality is it's not a secret that labor inspectors are so understaffed across different nations. It remains so difficult to actually monitor and enforce laws that currently exist. And while, you know, the multinationals have their own focus, their own agendas, their own markets that they serve, what about the other sectors that get left behind? Currently, we're seeing in Thailand, for example, the focus remains on fishing and seafood. Inspections will be focused there. What about all the other areas, poultry, strawberry farming, you know, other food and beverage industries that also need a closer look? So the enforcement, the government action needs to be very much one where there are enough resources to enforce existing laws. And ultimately, it has to come down to looking at eliminating the underlying conditions. If you look at the number of prosecutions for document retention, it's very low. It's not taken seriously at all. If you look at the number of cases that actually make it through for forced labor and or human trafficking, they're also very low. So clearly there is a big gap between protections that do exist, which a multinational might well tick off because it says the government cares. The proof of the pudding is in the implementation, and we're still far from seeing a good one.
Thank you very much. Mr. Van Zulkifli, would you like to speak to the collaboration between Malaysia and countries?
Thank you very much, Anna. I try to respond for all the questions here. The first one, I just want to inform that Malaysia now in the process of amending our law. So one of the main amendment here is we do our best to include domestic worker as well as part of to cover domestic worker. Under the law, under the Employment Act 1955. So if with that, so meaning to say under Part 12, all the benefits the domestic workers should get, so they will enjoy the same benefit with the formal worker. So that's the first one. The second one, with regard to the MOU with the government of Indonesia. For the conference information, actually we have MOU with Indonesia, but already expired for the past 3 years. And then Indonesian government keep asking Malaysia when we want to renew our MOU. But as of now, the government of Malaysia still thinking on that. That's what I want to say. The reason why, based from the past experience, I think you know better than me, actually under the MOU, I mean the previous MOU, the first MOU, the recruitment fee only 4,500 ringgit Malaysia. But at that time, we put in the MOU 4,500 ringgit Malaysia, but when we asked the candidate from the Indonesian side, they said until 10,000 or 14,000, something like that. The reason why, because they say they are middle person, so-called calo. Okay, you know better than me the word calo here. So the calo actually the main or big person which is taking care of one village. So if you want to approach to that particular village, you have to approach through this chalo. So if you want to get the person, okay, the candidate from, you have to go through him, and then he's the one who will decide whether you will get candidate or not. So if the Malaysian recruitment agency go there, they will ask how much you want to pay. If you say 2,000 ringgit, they say, never mind, another 3 months you can come. But if you say 5,000 ringgit, they say, okay, you can come now. Something like that. So these are the things. But what I want to say, under our previous MOU, it is clearly stated that Malaysian Recruitment Agency must working together with Indonesian Recruitment Agency, which is licensed under the both countries. But the issue here is we cannot comply with that cost of the recruitment fees. So these are the issues.
Thank you so much. Mindful of the little time we have left, Nilim, perhaps you could comment on the question regarding specific challenges of female migrant workers and the policy framework that, in a way, perpetuates these challenges and how that can be addressed.
Everything has to be looked through a gender lens. When policies are framed, when support services are framed, I mean, one has to look at it from a gender perspective. For example, labor attaches. Countries of origin post labor attaches in destination countries. Many of the migrants are women, but most of the labor attaches are male. So, I mean, we need to look everything through a gender lens. And with regards to domestic workers, this is the care sector is one of the sectors which is going to grow in the future with regards for demand for workers. So it's very important to include domestic work within labor law. I just wanted to comment briefly on what the representative from Samsung said and also about the other questions. I think, like, when we talk about recruitment fees and related costs, we are broadly defining all fees and costs that have been incurred for the worker to secure employment. So it's a broad definition. Now, costs should be reduced for the employer as well. We have cases where the cost for the employer is too high. So one of the interventions, like, there's so much talked about remittances from migrant workers, but if you look at the investments that governments make in countries of origin or destination into better labor migration governance, it's actually quite small. So you can argue that the recruitment process, the migration process, should be supported by the public employment services, by the public placement services, as what is happening in the Korean employment permit system. So there should be more investment by government into protecting migrant workers. What can be done collectively regarding access to remedy? I think complaints mechanisms instituting complaints mechanisms and support services for migrant workers from trade unions, from CSOs is very important. The ILO, in the framework of its Triangle in ASEAN project, supported by Australia and Canada, working with CSOs and trade unions, have, through the courts, got over $4 million ordered to be compensated to workers due to recruitment issues, wage issues, etc. And finally, internal migration is a big issue in countries like China, in India, as well as in Vietnam, Cambodia. And when we talk about recruitment fees and costs and the ILO principles, these are applying to all workers, international migrants as well as internal migrants.
Thank you so much. And Kitty, if you have any examples or suggestions to share regarding partnerships to provide effective remedy to workers, and also perhaps from the context of China, you have any insights as to how internal mobility comes into play when speaking about these issues?
Yeah, sure. So the question in relation to when you can't get a supplier on board and they won't repay the fees and you've exhausted all options and you've put them on a 30, 60, 90-day remediation plan, and then what, you cut that factory, and then what's the impact on those workers? So I think externally, that's where I would be looking to, in that particular jurisdictional country, what the social security and unemployment payment net could be, whether or not there is trade union representation and there are umbrella unions that can support those workers or other social services. Internally, from our perspective, where I mentioned earlier, we have a fund that we create based on the penalties that our suppliers pay into this fund when there have been core violations or breaches of the manufacturing agreement. So from our perspective, we channel those funds into programs that look at systemic issues around responsible labour, recruitment, working with the IOM, mapping corridors, trying to think about prevention. And I'm really happy to talk to you more about some other specific cases that we've dealt with. In terms of partnerships, absolutely, we're the first to acknowledge that Apple as a corporate entity can't resolve these problems alone. And in terms of concrete partnerships, I mean, I've mentioned we work with IOM, ILO through the Responsible Business Association or Alliance. We have the Responsible Labour Initiative, and through RBA and also kind of unilaterally, we do reach out to departments of labour. We have regular dialogue, for example, in China with Human Resources and Social Security. So, yeah, I think what we're seeing is in electronics, like so many other industries that have battled all of these issues before us, like garments, like footwear, like toys manufacturing, it's got to be collective engagement across multiple actors because, of course, the best intentioned company can't possibly resolve these massive issues alone.
Thank you so much, colleagues, and thank you all for your participation and for staying with us. I would like to bring up some last points before we close. Well, first, our session very much focused on frameworks, government efforts, and also multinational company efforts in promoting responsible recruitment and employment of migrant workers. Of course, supply chain approach to these issues has its limitations. Most migrant workers in many countries are not employed in first-tier suppliers of multinational companies. They are employed, if at all, in companies that are part of supply chains much further down. They're employed in many domestic-oriented industries, such as construction, which do not face the same incentives to clean up their practices. So I hope next time in a similar forum we can explore also ways to discuss and directly with local companies that are not part of the supply chain discussion about how conditions for migrant workers can be employed. It is especially to ensure that these conversations do not remain exclusive to supply chains of Western multinationals, that government role is absolutely critical. I'm glad we were able to bring in the regulatory perspective here and the important role that governments play in creating a level playing field for employers, for recruitment industry. In other words, through better regulation and enforcement, making being good a more viable business proposition than being bad. I also appreciated how much throughout the session we went back to actually various rights that are part of this solution. Again, it's not just about labor rights, but really broader fundamental rights of freedom of association, expression, protection of human rights defenders. Worker voice is not an app. It's having an actual real role in negotiating conditions of recruitment and employment. So access to collective bargaining is critical. And ultimately, when we speak about transnational challenges in better recruitment and employment for migrant workers, really it's about changing the business model of all members of the labor supply chain. It's not just about who pays the recruitment fees. Employers paying recruitment fees of workers will change the business practices, the business model of everyone involved, of the recruitment industry, of the employers, and also of the brands. Ultimately, we're speaking also about profit redistribution back to the workers. And I think it would be very interesting as we continue these discussions nationally, regionally, globally, within different fora, to start see more practically how this change occurs throughout the labor supply chain, what has changed for each participant as conditions for migrant workers have improved. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention and patience, and I would like to close the session. Thank you very much.
Hi all, there'll be a short coffee break outside and we'll resume at 3:45 at the last plenary session of the day. Thank you.